Thank you, Frank. It's a real honor for me to be introduced by you because I have great respect for your work, but that's also true of a number of other people in this room, so it's a real delight for me to be here. It's interesting that this is the 19th annual version of this meeting, and I've attended a number of the meetings over the years, and as I think back to the talk I might have given the first time I attended the meeting and the talk I'm giving today, what a transition there's been in my own work, but also in the field. And it's interesting to see how this conference in particular has helped lead that way. So today I'd like to talk about a journey, an intellectual journey that I've taken with a number of my colleagues that really is about trying to create impact from science. And I'd like to describe a conceptual model for this, but then also a number of case examples to talk about how we have addressed this problem in practice. As Frank mentioned when he introduced me, we have launched about 8 months ago a World Food Policy Center at Duke University. So the model of science that I'm going to talk about today is central to the work we're doing at this World Food Policy Center, but a lot of the work occurred at the Rudd Center at Yale that I left 5 years ago to become Dean of the School of Public Policy at Duke. But the concept behind the World Food Policy Center is to be a bridge across different areas of food policy, and these are the 4 fundamental clusters that we're looking to bridge. And it was our hypothesis going into this enterprise that work that occurs in each of these areas affects all the others, but the areas are not connecting very well. And so there's, of course, a whole world of people that work on agriculture and environment. Those people very rarely connect with the obesity community. That community, in turn, very rarely connects with the people that are working on food insecurity. And as a consequence, you get several problems. You get policies that might look like a win in one area, but have adverse consequences in another. For example, dumping commodities into schools, like butter, for example, might look like a win to the dairy farmers, but not be so great for the health of children. You get places where areas are at loggerheads, like the debate that exists now between the food insecurity and obesity communities about whether SNAP recipients should be permitted to use their benefits to buy sugared beverages. The fact that these areas are at loggerheads has basically stalled any progress on the issue. And so nothing is happening where something might have happened had the areas been better connected early on. You also miss the opportunity to have large coalitions of groups arguing for change and advocating for change if the bridging were occurring. So that's our goal. It's a very daunting enterprise because it's hard to be expert at one thing, much less all of these. So we are connecting and collaborating as much as we can with people in these other areas to try to accomplish the bridging. Now, I'm not going to talk too much more about this center at the moment or today, but if any of you are interested in learning more, I'd be happy to talk to you about it at breaks. So the question, the journey, intellectual journey that I discussed begins with this question about how good are we really at creating change from the intellectual academic research that we do. And we all, I think, behind the motivations for taking on the academic work that we do is the hope that we might make a difference. Of course, we could make more money in the private sector and be doing lots of different things with our degrees and our careers, but we hope to create social change, I think, ultimately from the research we do. And so we produce knowledge that we hope will serve society, but the question is, does society really get served by it as much as might be the case? And so the question we ask is what lies in the middle? What determines whether science has impact on society? And of course, we are specifically interested in the diet, nutrition, and obesity area. So the frustration that I've encountered over my career, and this probably goes back about, 15, 20 years or so, was that there was a lot of academic research that could be having policy impact but wasn't, or wasn't having much impact on the practices that were going on in communities. And that made me stop to think about whether this might change and we could create more impact from the available science. And so the frustration was that research tends to reach very small audiences. Researchers tend to talk to each other through journals and conferences and things like that. Sometimes a field can be extremely small, relatively small number of scholars might read the particular work we do. I mean, it could be 4 or 5 people. Those 4 or 5 people reinforce each other by inviting each other to meetings, citing each other's work, and so you feel like there's impact within this small group, but whether there's broader impact can be questioned. Whether the research tends to miss key audiences, that is, people in a position to do something about the problem, and that leads to poor links between scholarship and, in this case, public policy. So it begins with how we construe impact. So if you look at the way our field thinks about impact, we have a number of ways of measuring this, but it basically amounts to how much other scholars cite your work. Now, if somebody from the outside of our field looked in on it and said, that's what you consider impact? I mean, are you making any difference in the world? Are you making people's lives better? Are you changing anything of substance? Then they might think those are the important questions rather than what your H-index is. But we have constructed this sort of internal system of measuring impact that we've lost track of the big picture about whether we're really creating impact. And what we do with science, I think, can be analogized to a relay race. So in a relay race, of course, you can only qualify to win the race and have any chance of succeeding if the baton is successfully passed from one party to the next. Now in science, we have this sort of wishful thinking in a way that we do our work. It's not our job to communicate it out there into the world other than to other scientists. We're not trained to do it. We're not reinforced to do it. It's not considered in tenure and promotion decisions, et cetera. So we have this magical belief that somebody will pick up the baton once we create our science and do something with it that will create impact. But because we're not trained, we don't know who the baton should be passed to. We're pretty clumsy at passing the baton. Whenever we try, about as sophisticated as we get, our press releases, once in a while a policy brief, that sort of thing. And so the baton doesn't get passed effectively, and that minimizes the impact some of the work could have. We also do things, I think, internally within the field that hamstring ourselves. So let's just say it was our job to make science as least relevant to the world as possible. Now, of course, none of us would ever think of it that way, but if that were our task, what would we do? We would make science very slow. In a world where decisions are made very quickly, especially at the policy level, we would take a really long time to get funded to do the work. It would take a long time to get permission to do the work if you're doing human subjects. It would then take a long time to do the work and then think of the publication process. That takes forever. I mean, now you have journals finally, years, decades after it was possible, publishing things online. But otherwise, there was a year publication lag in most places. So this hamstrings us. It would be poorly communicated, that is, we would only communicate with each other. It would be unresponsive to the world of people who could make a difference with the information. It would be only programmatic rather than strategic. I'll come back to that. There would be conflicts of interest that undermine the credibility of the work, and certainly that's an issue in our field. And we would create indecipherable jargon that we use internally but makes it hard to communicate with the outside world. So I think of my field of psychology, for example, sometime came along with the word symptomatology to describe symptoms. And we use methodology to describe methods. I mean, it goes on and on and on, where we make things inaccessible when we don't need to. And we do all these things extremely well. We're socialized to do them. We're trained to do them. We're reinforced for doing them. But it makes the work inaccessible. So here's how we went about trying to address this fundamental frustration. Our hope, ultimately, was that research would create impact on other scientists. It would create social and policy change, and it seems we were pretty good at the first link, but not so good at the others. So we wanted to think about how the work might matter and came up with this particular model that we refer to as strategic research. And it begins with thinking about who are the change agents. relative to whatever problem one might be studying. That is, who is in a position to do something about that problem, and then how can we create knowledge that will be helpful to them, not necessarily just to other scientists. Now those white boxes, I'm going to fill those in with some hypothetical change agents, and these will change according to the problem that one addresses. But in the obesity area, one might think research could affect a variety of parties. Legislators are an obvious example because they're out there passing laws that are relevant to the work we do. Regulatory agencies are incredibly important. At local, state, and federal levels, of course, you have agencies like the USDA, the FDA, the FTC, and other agencies that have enormous power and impact in some cases. And sometimes the issues that we might address would be relevant to them, and they become a relevant audience. The courts can be very important. You can think about the important role the courts played in the tobacco wars, and increasingly the courts are going to be important in respect to nutrition and obesity. The press can be important if public opinion becomes the change agent or becomes the pathway to change. And I'll give some examples of that. The NGO community can be very important because they're out there advocating for change. And of course, in our case, we have a food industry that could become a pathway to change. So again, these are only a partial list of potential change agents, and depending on what particular topic one is talking about, there will be a different set of change agents. But this notion of strategic science that we think about begins with finding out or identifying who are the change agents and then talking to them about information gaps that could be filled that would be helpful in their space. And so the model looks like this, where it begins with identification of the change agents, developing strategic research questions, conducting the research, and then filling the gap that very often gets left by communicating this information back to the change agents. And you hope that this creates a virtuous cycle of solutions. And very often, talking with the change agents generates an interesting set of research questions that one might not have thought to ask otherwise, because basically we're talking to each other as scientists. So this two-way communication between